Oftentimes, I used to tell people that we were going to have, I only live 7/10 of a mile from here, so we were going to have worship whether or not there were 2 inches or 2 feet of snow or whatever it was, that we were going to go ahead and worship, because if I could get here, I would open the doors. And if nobody comes because it's unwise for you to leave your neighborhood, then that's perfectly fine. But if I could get here, I was going to at least open the doors. And the funny thing is, over the years, it doesn't appear to be so this morning, but over the years, for many folks, we gained all sorts of people over the years because all these other worship centers closed across the city, and we'd be the only one open. So somebody who was looking for a first Sunday place they could visit might venture out and come to the otherwise open despite snow kind of place. So I like it, although I am not fond of cold weather. I'll just be straight with you. I would be just as happy if it was a balmy 75 degrees outside, but it isn't. So get over it, James, and I have. We're here and it's warm. I was so delighted to come in. There was a time when we didn't have the thermostat on a timer, so on especially cold days, I would have to get here by like 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning so I could dial up the thermostat so it'd be warm in here. And I am so glad that the days of automated thermostats have come along so that it automatically, Eric was delighted when he came in and it was warm, he told me, so was Tom, and so was I. We were all delighted. I just wish the lobby would be a little warmer, but you know, life is, you can't have everything. It's warm in here. So I'm delighted that all of you who could make it. I suspect we're going to have a spike of online folks who are with us today, which is just fine. Linda told you we're in week 3 of a series about living a better story. We started with the story of David's call. He's anointed by Samuel. Samuel calls him out and says, "You're going to be king because Saul has failed." And it sounds like he's making a step up by becoming king, but that's not what makes that a better story. What makes it a better story is he's doing what God wants for him. God hopes for him and dreams for him. So that's the first piece. Last week, we talked about building character. Guess what? All of us are going to make mistakes. We're going to mess up. But the good news, even when we mess up, the thing to do is admit our mistakes and learn from them and move forward. That's what we learned last week. At least that's a summary, I think. Today, we are now, if you've been following the series, you're thinking, wait a second. The first week, we started at the very beginning of David. Last week, David was king, and now we're going backwards, James. Are we going backwards? Are we chronologically out of order in David's life? The answer, yes, we are. So if you're thinking to yourself, hold on a second, why is Saul chasing him? I thought Saul was dead and he was king. No, because we're going back to the middle of his story. 1 Samuel 24. Now, just to kind of set this up, Saul was chasing David. That is, he had an army that he was chasing. David had about 600 men in his little tiny renegade army, and Saul had about, I don't know, somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 soldiers in his army. And he's been pursuing him. Now, right when he gets close to catching David, he gets word that the Philistines, who were longtime enemies of the Israelites, were marauding back in Israel. So just as he's about to get David, catch him, he has to go back and take care of the Philistines. Because after all, the most important thing as king is to make sure the Philistines are taken care of. So he goes back to do that. And that's where we pick up this morning in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. Even as Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was informed that David was in the En-Gedi wilderness. So Saul took 3,000 men selected from all Israel and went to look for David and his soldiers near the rocks of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens beside the road where there was a cave. Saul went into the cave to use the restroom. You know, they didn't have roadside bathrooms, just so you know, when you're on the road in those days. In the original Hebrew, it said something else, but it means going to the restroom, essentially. So in any case, went into the cave to use the restroom. Meanwhile, David and his soldiers were sitting in the very back of the cave. David's soldiers said to him, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he promised you, 'I will hand your enemy over to you, and you can do with him whatever you think best.'" So David snuck up and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. But immediately David felt horrible that he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. "The Lord forbid," he said to his men, "that I should do something like that to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, because he is the Lord's anointed." So David held his soldiers in check by what he said, and he wouldn't allow them to attack Saul. Saul then left the cave and went on his way. Well, if we were to read on in the story, I'm just reading 1 through 7. We read on the story. David comes out of the king, comes out of the cave, calls out to Saul and says, "Saul, I had you in a vulnerable spot, dude. I could have taken you down. I didn't." And then Saul feels bad and says, "You know what? Everybody tells me you're against me. I even believe it in my heart, but you're not really against me. You are going to make a better king than I am." Now, that doesn't end the battle. This is not the end of the story. It could be. So it seemed to me that if we're going to talk about something, it seems very important to me to talk about ambition. In fact, I decided to set that aside as a whole conversation for us, because we live in, I think probably if I were to live in any culture in the world, but I can't speak about any culture in the world. In this culture, ambition drives us. And ambition is a word that means two different things. It is the ultimate goal you're targeting. An ambition, we could point to something and say, "That's my ambition is to be president of the United States." That's a targeted goal. But ambition is also a quality within us that drives us forward. And sometimes it's kind of a pointless driving. It's kind of like, I have ambition. You know, we say of people who seem to just get up and be at work, 6 hours before anybody else and stay 6 hours after everybody else leaves. We say those people have ambition, or maybe that they're stupid. I don't know which one, but they have ambition. As a quality, that thing that kind of drives them, that makes them just a little bit more anxious to do something about it. Well, I think David has both of those kinds of ambition. And there is, in all honesty, nothing wrong with ambition. I want to start by saying that having ambition is not wrong. Ambition in and of itself. Sometimes our ambition is for things perhaps we ought not to be ambitious for. I have an ambition periodically, though it goes against the rules of the United Methodist Church. I have the ambition to play the lottery and win, especially when it's $450 million. There would be no challenge about where we might relocate or any of those kinds of things, because with $450 million after taxes, probably about $50 million, there would still be plenty, left over to buy something and find something. Would be no challenge whatsoever. So every once in a while I have that kind of ambition. But sometimes ambition just to have money, or just to have success, or just to look good, or just to have the prettiest wife, or the handsomest husband, or any of those kinds of things is, those can be side benefits. But the truth is, I don't think those are good kinds of ambition. Just to have success, just to look good, just to be highly esteemed in and of itself. To be faithful to who we are, to be faithful to God, those are the kinds of ambitions. And David has that kind of ambition. David has the kind of ambition that is already blessed by God. So that's good. Imagine for a moment all of us, whatever our ambitions are in this room, have ambitions that God wants to bless, that God likes. I want world peace. I'm going to do whatever it takes to make world peace, if it includes killing everyone who gets in the way. See, I've crossed a line there. I think the only way we'll have world peace if there's only one person left over in the world. And that one person won't even be at peace with themselves. So let's just be honest, peace is an elusive ambition. But let's just imagine for a moment, whatever our ambitions are, the ones God wants for us, that God wants to bless, that God wants us to have, like David being king. Well, then there's this other side. Guess what? If you have an ambition, there are always going to be people who don't agree with your ambition. In our story, Saul does not start off or really ever come fully to terms with David's ambition. Why? Because David's ambition is to do what Saul is already doing. And there can only be one king in Israel. But guess what? If you have ambition and a dream and a call to do something with your life or a direction to go, there are going to be naysayers in your life who don't think that's a good idea. Who are going to tell you, that is not a good goal for you. You should not go for that. You should do something else. You should be more successful. You should make more money. You should have a better title. And you just need to realize that other people are going to lay on you their understandings of what a good ambition are. It's not necessarily that they're bad people. I'm not sure I want to go so far. Of course, if we read a lot about Saul, we have a sense that maybe he's not such a good guy. But I don't want us to think, well, Saul's just a bad guy, which is why he, hates David's ambition. Not everybody who hates your ambition is a bad guy or gal. They just may think that you're deluded in believing that that's even possible, that you ought to be doing something more. They might say to you something like, to whom much is given, much is expected. And their much is different than what your much is. Consequently, you disagree on what your ambition is. Saul, kind of in this story, represents those people. There's another group of people in this story that don't get named, but they get named. And that's David's men. David's men agree with David's ambition to become king. But they think that it's about becoming king no matter what the cost. That the end justifies the means. Saul is in your hands. He's vulnerable. Anybody who's ever gone to the bathroom knows you're not really able to defend yourself very well. He's vulnerable right now. Just go kill him. It doesn't matter if the ambition is good. It doesn't matter how you get there. Now that's not a good message. That's wrong. I think we started with ambition is good, and the right ambition is good. That's good. We have people who don't like our ambitions. We have people who like our ambitions, but who are willing to sell their souls to get their ambitions. Be very careful of those, because you can be drawn right into that. I was just reading yesterday afternoon. I hate to go to politics because it always drives me a little bit over the edge, but this is a political story. But I was reading, that the campaign director for the Republican guy who ran against Jerry Connally has now been indicted and convicted of doing what you're not supposed to do with PAC funds. Now, it could have just as easily been a Democratic guy, campaign director, doing the same thing against a Republican guy, drawing PAC funds. But PAC funds are supposed to be, political action committee funds are not supposed to be directed by the candidate at all. So when you call on those things, you get in trouble. Now, the intriguing thing about that is it did not in the end affect the outcome. But the truth is, just because you think your candidate should win doesn't mean that you should cheat the rules. You should go some other way, that you should do something that's illegal or immoral or wrong. So the question for you becomes discovering for yourself what is the ambition that you have for yourself and that perhaps God has for you, has wired you to do, and then pursue that with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength if you must. But be careful that pursuing the ambition does not blind you to the fact that you too can make mistakes on the way to that ambition. That you can, if you get to the place where you see that end and the end becomes so important to you that you don't care what you do to get there, then you're going to lose a piece of your soul in that journey. Now, David's men, saw this as an opportunity, a really easy opportunity. You don't even have to fight the army. Just go kill Saul. He's at the front door of the cave. Go in the bathroom. David gets to the front. He almost buys into it. He almost buys into this. He gets to the front of the cave, and he reaches out, and he cuts off a piece of Saul's cloak. David, I just have to say an aside, David must have been the most stealthy dude you can ever imagine, crawling around in the dark, that he can get to a guy who is like by himself in the silence of the cave. There are probably some noises, but they're separate, and chops off a chunk of his cloak without Saul even noticing. But Saul doesn't notice. And then David, fortunately, has this pang of realization that he's not good. This isn't the way God wants it to happen. God wants him to be king, but not at this cost. Not at this moment. It's not worth selling my soul for the end. So he goes back to his men and he lets them know this is not the way God wants us to live out our ambition. This is not the end. The end does not justify the means. Now, we live in a society sometimes that will tell us something quite to the contrary. That indeed the end does justify the means. If the end is feeding everyone in the world that's hungry, that the means may be killing everybody who's in the way of it, maybe that's not it. Maybe that's not acceptable. I don't know why I keep coming back to killing. I don't know what that's all about. I think the story is about killing. But, maybe I'm just wired in negative ways as well. I think that this story is an invitation for us to be very careful. Do you know who you are? Do you know who you are? And who God is calling you to be? And do you realize that it's not just some kind of end goal that's out there with some squiggly journey that gets you there? It also is, God is calling you to be the person you are right now, in this moment. God wants in this moment for you to be all that you can be, even though you haven't reached whatever that ambition is that comes down the road. So in this moment, what if David's last word, God called him to be king, God wanted him to be king, he kills Saul, but then trips on the way out of the cave and dies himself. His final word as king, his final word as God's chosen king was murdering Saul in the cave. That'd be his legacy. That'd be all he'd be remembered for. He got this close. He killed Saul, but he did not make the kingdom. Then his story would either be kind of a punchline, or his story would be an empty one that ended in the murder of the rightful king, at least as far as everybody else was concerned. So if I were going to try to draw out the lessons here, I would start by saying, once again, what I said to you last week is the most important thing. Know yourself. Take the time in your life to figure out who you are. James, why do you keep saying this? Because I don't think people take time to figure it out. I think they just start out on a journey and, don't turn, don't shift, don't do anything. I have decided I'm going to do this thing and this is what I'm going to do. I think sometimes stopping long enough to say, is this really what I want for myself? Is this really who God's calling me to be? I once, I was in high school. What was my goal in life initially? I was going to be president of the United States. I don't want the job now. I'm not even interested vaguely, and I could never be elected. I've learned the reality of politics. I could never be elected short of Jesus coming from the sky and magically making me president in some way beyond, because I don't think I could do the dance. I don't think I could do the dance. In fact, I know I couldn't do the dance. But that was my ambition. Knowing myself at the time or not knowing myself at all. I just thought that the highest thing ought to be the thing I ought to shoot for. And what's the highest thing? At the time in my life, it was political office and power. That's what I thought was the most powerful thing I could do, and that's what I was going to shoot for. Well, I've had a few detours since then. I went off to college. I, was going to go one way. I pictured, a short military career, get that under my belt, And then I would be able to enter into politics, and I will have served my nation, that whole 9 yards. God had a different plan, called me to something else. And the next thing you know, I was headed towards ministry 2 years into college. And I thought, oh, this sounds like a really good thing. I bet you God wants me to be a bishop. That's what God wants. God wants me to be in charge of the United Methodist Church, at least of a conference. This must be. So in my mind, I targeted that. Early on, it was like, I'm going to be a bishop. I don't want the job. I have discovered what it is. You know, there's a lot. We have a wonderful bishop right now. A wonderful, wonderful man, deeply spiritual. I have the deepest admiration for Bishop Cho. And just being in his presence, you know, I have actually seen people who are not happy with Bishop Cho approach him and ream him out. I don't know how you do that to a bishop and think that you're going to go on. But in any case, and you know what he does? He deflected it. And in the most gentle and kind way, he understood why the person was angry with him. He deflected it, handled it lovingly, patiently, in a way that would not have worked with me. You know, I don't want to be a bishop. Somebody comes and approaches me that way, I say, fine, you know what? I make your appointment. You may like that mid-range appointment you have. I've got a small little tiny church in the middle of nowhere. You're going there next year. Hope you enjoy it. You and your whole family. In fact, the school system really stinks, and you've got 3 little kids. Good for you. You won yourself the jackpot, baby. That's why I'm not a bishop. That's why God never wanted me to be a bishop, never was interested in me on that trajectory. Plus, there's a lot of administrative tasks. And guess who is the worst administrator you personally know? Standing right here in front of you, baby. So, no, I just couldn't do it. That's not my calling. That's not what God wanted for me. But you see how easily you can kind of get an ambition moving you in a direction you think that God might be calling you in, because you think God's calling you to something and you shoot for the highest piece of it. And maybe God wants you to shoot for something different. So know who you are. I know who I am now. And that's what makes me completely satisfied and delighted where I am. This is where God would have me to be right now. Now, tomorrow I may get a call and the bishop may say, we've changed our mind. We're sending you somewhere else. And, you know, I'll cross that bridge when it comes. It happened 2 years ago. They called me and said, we think we're going to move you somewhere. And I said, what? 3 years ago I said, I think it's time to move me somewhere. Did they move me then? No. They said, no, we feel God's calling you to go right back. And I said, great, I'll come back. The year later, when I said, I'm absolutely sure God wants me to stay here, the cabinet calls and says, we think it's time for you to go. And I'm like, what? Fine, do whatever you want to do, I'll do it. But in the end, they changed their mind. So it's an adventure. You need to know who you are, because then, no matter what happens to you in life, where you find yourself, that's the right place right now, in this moment. In this moment. It's not that I have no ambitions in life. I was recently talking to a clergy person who said, James, do you have no ambition? Do you just have no ambition? You have been in that church at St. James for 23 years. Why haven't you moved? You could be in a bigger church. You could have more people. And I said, maybe I'd go to another church and it would grow down to nothing. Everybody would leave. Crack-headed James Henry, get him out. They'd all, I don't know. This is where I'm called to be. And as long as I am, I can be satisfied. Frustrated sometimes, crazy over the edge sometimes, but this is where God wants me to be. Know yourself. That's the beginning. That's the beginning of getting your ambitions straight, is knowing yourself. And at 52, I finally think I sort of know who I am. It took a long time and a long journey, but I finally have a sense and am comfortable with that. Now when I have an ambition, I can be relatively comfortable that maybe it's in my wheelhouse, part of how God has shaped and called me, my passion. So know yourself. That's a good place to start. And then everything we learned from this story today, once you know yourself, it's fine for you to set an ambition. If you discover it's the wrong ambition, don't be afraid to change it. We live in a society that tells you to set your goals, and then when you change your goals midstream, they figure you failed. Don't care what they say. Get over it. Get over it. We live in a world where we're constantly trying to get somebody else to pat us on the back. You know what? If you chase after people patting you on the back the rest of your life, you will have an empty, empty, empty life. Because it's not about getting patted on the back. Be careful about who you are, and don't worry what everybody else says. If you set a goal, it's the wrong one, and you have to change course, trusting that God will show you if that's the wrong course. Unless you're a college student, be sure what you're going to do, Mikey, when you go off to college, exactly, no changing your major, straight through 4 years, that's it. Just a heads up. He was our only, college student in the room, getting ready to head off, so I just thought, poor Mikey, you'll never come back now. See, this is why we don't call people out in church. In any case, after you've tried and gotten a direction, then learn those lessons. Don't let somebody else tell you that it's the wrong ambition. Don't let somebody who agrees with your ambition tell you to do it by any means necessary. Be careful to guard your own character and who you are. And dream of the way God would have you fulfill it in the end. You'll get there. I know you want to get there now. If you're like me, patience is not your virtue. It is not your virtue at all. You want to be there now. But God's time is not your time. So develop, learn, pray for, wonder about patience. David got it in that moment. Could have killed Saul and instead was patient, became king, and this was not an ugly mark on his story. He had some other ugly marks we learned about last week, but this one was not one. He did not choose to kill Saul. Ambition. It's okay. Just be careful what it's for and be sure it's what God wants for you. And then pursue it, taking each moment as it comes. And if it's really God's ambition for you, you'll get there. You'll get there. All right, well, that's what I got when I was reading this text. Next week, we're going to talk about transformation. This is all about story. How do you live a better story? Careful about your ambitions. Watch out for character mistakes and learn character from the mistakes you make, and just try to be in what God wants for you. Next week, we're going to talk about transformation. How does God transform our stories so that we can see them not only as our stories, but part of the big stories, God's big story. How are we going to see that? That's next Sunday. It's time for us to pray.